I am thrilled to kick off the second session in our year-long series on the intersection of digital markets and national security. This is part of a larger initiative at Georgetown called the Digital Economy and Security Collaborative, which is co-run by Professor Kate McNamara and me here at Georgetown. It's supported by funding from the Open Society Foundation and from the Board of Regents here at Georgetown, as well as the US-China Dialogue Initiative. Before I get into introducing our speaker for today, I just want to acknowledge that Georgetown's success today is in part a product of the enslaved labor and the sale of enslaved people. And we at Georgetown are committed to unearthing this past and thinking through its implications for injustice and slavery today. And if you're interested in that initiative, you can go to slavery.georgetown.edu. With that, I'd like to turn to our speaker for today, who is Sarah Krebs. She is a professor at Cornell University. And in addition to that, she is the recent author of the book, Social Media and International Relations. I am going to drop that in the chat so that everybody can Amazon.com right now and pick yourself up a copy of that. The event today is going to be structured first with introductory remarks from Professor Krebs about the intersection of social media and national security issues. Then we're going to have Q&A where I kind of do like a Kojo Namdi. If you're from the DC area, I'll ask a few questions of Sarah, and then we'll turn it over to the audience. So as you're listening at the beginning part of the session, if you have questions that you're interested in the speaker addressing, if you can put them in the chat as well, and then I will moderate those with Professor Krebs as the final session of the session. So with that, without further ado, I want to turn it over to Professor Krebs to give her remarks and let the event begin.
Thank you, Abe, and thanks, Kate and the Mortara Center in Georgetown for hosting this talk today. I'm excited to be here. I have been working on this topic of social media and international politics for now several years. And you know, I used to, until this week, actually, I would, as my framing context, talk about Capitol Hill hearings on from Facebook from a couple of years ago, 2018 and 19. But I have new fodder as of last week, so I'm going to start with that, actually. So let me now share my screen. Which is from this, the hearing last week. Wait, what? I don't know if this happens to you guys, to you all. These, what 1 month, let alone year, are we in? But the point, operative point, is this, which is this exchange between Facebook's head of security and Senator Blumenthal. Will you commit to ending Finsta? And it was just kind of interesting from the standpoint of someone who studies both technology and politics, because this vignette has happened time after time, which is that the tech side of it says that's actually not what we do. We don't do Finsta. And this then became part of this from Saturday Night Live, the opening skit this weekend. Now, this is a different individual. This was the whistleblower, which then occasioned this exchange here. But this has happened time after time where we have seen a noble effort, I would say, on the part of legislators to understand the technology, and clear manifestation too that the people in technology don't quite understand the politics. So this was the one I usually would use, which is the exchange that followed from the 2016 Senate investigation into the election and the role of foreign interference in it. And so Orrin Hatch says, how do you sustain a business model in which users don't pay for your service? Senator, we run ads. So what's been so interesting to follow this this topic of social media and national security and technology and politics is that, you know, and I put this at the bottom, Zuckerberg's comment, in a lot of ways, Facebook is more like a government than a traditional company. I think this is, I think,
Sarah,
some of what we're seeing in these
Sarah,
hearings.
can I
Yeah.
interrupt just for a quick second? think your screen is not shared. And so if there are slides,
There are.
we're not seeing them.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I will remove myself now.
I feel like I want to go back and show you these photos of
That's
these
totally fine.
senators.
You have the authority to do that.
You'd think after a year and a half of Zoom talks that I'd be an absolute pro at screen sharing. Here we go. Okay, so this was, yes, this was the scene from last week, including on the, so we're missing the animation now, but we'll make the best of it. So the exchange between the members of Congress, which again has been kind of recapitulated over time when these members of the tech community have come in front of Congress. And so as I was suggesting, there really, I think, is a noble effort, at least on the part of leaders on Capitol Hill, to understand the technology. But I do think time after time, there's a sense in which maybe there is this gap. And I think actually that speaks a little bit to the themes of this seminar series, which is a better understanding of kind of breaking down silos and a better connection, not just between technology and politics, but within the political science community on different aspects of these questions. So as I was suggesting, the longer term antecedents to this before the recent whistleblower hearings really came from the 2016 election. And the key points here are and I think this is the real focus here for social media and national security, that came into sharp relief because of the election, which is that these individuals were masquerading as Americans and trying to use content to polarize on the basis of societal or ideological or racial differences. And what's, I think, clear from the study after the investigation is that not only has that not ended, but it is becoming more sophisticated. And that's really been the focus of a lot of the work I've done, and which I'll try to talk about briefly in today's remarks by way of framing, which is what are the ways in which this can take place, and what are the ways in which, by this I mean kind of foreign election interference through social media, and how is this evolving and becoming more sophisticated? Let's see. Slideshow. Okay, here we go. All right. So this is something that I think, actually Jake Sullivan mentioned this morning. We have a proliferation of autonomous disinformation. And as the National Security Advisor said, if we don't turn our back on this tide, this digital revolution will grow darker. And so the question I think that animates this work is, can this automated disinformation influence the political landscape? And so my empirical work has focused on that question of how and under what conditions automated and targeted misinformation through social media can manipulate public opinion. And so kind of the theoretical backdrop of this is just how we understand the media and international politics and national security. And so the vehicle for this misinformation is the media. And the kind of logic behind this, it's a very complicated web of arrows, but the way in which this kind of transpires, especially in a democracy, is that we have complicated policies that require popular support to be sustainable. So the democratic populace is going into this marketplace of ideas, the media, to learn about the policy. And so the theoretical way in which this is understood is as both the democratic dilemma of understanding policies, and from a communications standpoint, a political communication standpoint, is referred to as the differential gains model of media consumption. So people are trying to sift through pros and cons of policies, because all policies have trade-offs. And how it has worked in theory is that you go into this media marketplace, And the differential gains model suggests that you come out all the wiser. And the question is that actually what takes place? And so we know that social media is very much kind of the repository for content, not just content that makes us laugh or smile, but for news itself. And so, you can think about, and there is all kinds of data on this, but the real point here is that more people are acquiring their news from social media. Reddit, Twitter, Facebook are the sites with the most news-focused users. I put this other perspective on the right because it foreshadows one of the conclusions from my work, which is that a pretty high percentage of people say that social media is inaccurate. And that's kind of a double-edged sword in this context, because what it suggests is exactly what one of the perils of this context is, which is that people might not trust anything they read. And so that's, again, foreshadowing one of my conclusions from this. So first we have to understand, is social media different from traditional media? And so one argument is, look, this is just old wine in new bottles. We've had reports of novel vehicles for news for a long time. I saw a tweet on this, I think from the 1990s or early 2000s today, someone talking about how dial-up internet was going to be the demise of society because it was going to take people away from their families and distract them. And so I think the sort of counter argument to social media being different is to say, look, every time we have new technologies, we always think they're different. And most of the time it's just a difference in degree versus a difference in kind. I do think social media is different because there really aren't gatekeepers. Anyone can post or read. The good part about that is that it's very democratic. The downside of that is that people are often not very discerning. So we know that fake news travels faster. It's more viral than sober news. And along those lines, it's easier to amplify than misinformation. And so we have the ability through technology to take the news that already is going viral and then amplifying that further. And so one argument here that I talk about in my recent book is that we maybe are looking at a differential losses model of media consumption. So we have individuals going into this marketplace of ideas and they're actually coming out confused or they're coming out polarized. And so the proliferation of fake news is a pretty visible culprit here. And one of the things is, again, as we think about what might be different here that I think looks different in a digital space is digital personalization. And I think this gets at some of what Jake Sullivan was referring to as automated misinformation. And so what we know from 2016 and the Cambridge Analytica use of big data is that we can understand people's both political and psychological profiles and then target those in ways that we see in marketing more generally, but we can target those to try to insinuate into decision-making framework of individuals and polarize them or cause them to want to engage in more kind of nefarious political participation outside normal political channels. So I think that's one aspect of automation, which is the use of big data to understand these political and psychological profiles and then target those accordingly to maximize the impact. We also know that there's a proliferation of fakes. And again, one thing that I'll say at the end that I think comes up here as well is that it's not that we actually believe that this video on the right with Nancy Pelosi is the same as the one on the left. But as this content proliferates, our society becomes kind of nihilistic about it. Like, well, we don't know what to believe, and so we won't believe anything. And in a democracy that's as pernicious potentially as it is to believe the wrong thing, because I think as we saw in the case of the pandemic or continue to see is that the mistrust of political authorities becomes problematic in its own right. And the importance of trust in a democratic political system, I think, can't be overstated. So where I've been doing my recent work is on really kind of the automation of text itself. And so if we think back again, my kind of misuse case in mind here is the Internet Research Agency that I showed a picture of in one of the previous slides. And so the individuals there have these quotas of content generation. English is not their first language. There are often ways you can identify actually pretty easily that this is not an authentic English speaker. But if we have kind of these natural language models that come along to essentially do what this one does, now we have GPT-3, which is an even more advanced version of this, to generate authentic, credible content, can we now just automate and kind of intersect with that digital personalization to really at scale manipulate people's political views? So I'm not going to get into the empirics of that. I might just show kind of, how this works. These language models are based on machine learning and learning from huge volumes of internet text. And they then basically engage in kind of text prediction based on what they've learned is the most common content that follows. So can you please come here? And here is most often at the end of a sentence with, can you please come? So, you can kind of, if again, put yourself in the shoes of the person in St. Petersburg, you just like churn out this content and you can now produce things like this. So we have, I'm not going to talk about these experiments we ran just in the interest of time, but we were generating some tweets here. And the ones on, I have to look because they're actually just really hard, even if you study this to see the difference. The human written ones are on the right, and I guess I highlighted the machine generated ones in red on the left. And so what we were curious about is if you generated kind of new Twitter accounts, bots, or whatever, can you manipulate political attitudes? And I might just show like two representative charts from this. People were basically able to see, as you can see here, that this is the machine generated ones on the right, this machine generated GPT-3 on the right and human on the left. And people did sort of rate the human tweets as more real than the machine generated ones. But what was interesting to us is that they largely engage with the machine generated ones at either the same or in some cases higher rates than the human ones. And so it speaks a little bit to what I was suggesting earlier, is that that the inauthentic account, because of kind of what sells, that people are more likely to engage with it at higher rates than the boring human written ones. So I guess I'm going to skip through a bit more content here because in the interest of time, I'd be happy to talk more about other experiments I've done on this range of topics. But I think the important takeaways here are that we know that these the interest is there to manipulate democratic politics, and that it's possible because we have this marketplace of ideas, and that these tools are becoming increasingly sophisticated to generate either fake news or polarizing news at scale, and that this can really kind of have the effect of disrupting democratic representation. And so, it also has these sort of asymmetric advantages. If you look at the amount that the US spent in election security versus what the Internet Research Agency's budget is, it creates kind of this this challenge from a national security perspective, which is that, much like terrorism, kind of causing this overreaction, there's a possibility in which this previous experience now requires that we spend far more than they spend in actually generating the threat. And so again, I think one of the questions and things to wrestle with here is, how do we kind of think about this? How do we balance and trade off kind of the economic virtues of innovation in social media with some of these concerns about either foreign election interference, or, as we see and have seen in recent weeks, this almost the kind of algorithmic capitalism in which we are taking advantage of kind of people's emotions in order to both innovate and generate revenue. So at the end, I had told Abe before the session that I'd focused less on the economic side. So there I did, I wove it in at the end. So I'm gonna just kind of leave it there and look forward to Abe's comments and the Q&A. Thanks so much for listening.
Great, thanks, Sarah. So first, I want to just ask people in the audience, if you have a chance, you should put your comments in the chat, and then I will raise those as the conversation goes through. So the first thing that I just wanted to ask you about, which is for me, one of the biggest problems in this domain of social media national security is the changing nature of the social media industry. And so, I think when we started these conversations, which wasn't that long ago, if you think about, Facebook hasn't even existed for that long, but there was this very decentralized version of what social media was. It was, everybody gets to be involved, and the companies are all about freedom, and there was the Twitter revolution, and we had this a vision that the free market of ideas was in line with the economic incentives of the companies, because they were really there to give a platform to citizens to express themselves. But what the revelations, I think, particularly of last week and the last month, have shown is that the companies' incentives have diverged from that. That really they're about addiction. They're very similar to like a tobacco company. It's like, it's not about the free market of ideas and giving everybody a space. It's actually promoting those ideas that are most likely to create controversy and to keep people's eyeballs, and that the algorithms are then structured that way. And so when you're thinking about this larger problem of disinformation and how other countries could take advantage of this business model and the way it's structured, I'm just wondering if it shifts the way governments have to respond, because it's no longer about equal access and giving people, the free market of ideas, but it's actually a bias algorithm that has been trained, because it knows, like you were showing, it knows that we actually prefer the bias algorithm to the human algorithm. So I just kind of, it's a very big question, and there's no like one answer, but it just kind of how you think about that in your work, and what you might think about what we need to research to understand what a governance architecture would look like in a place where the business model isn't necessarily just an open platform, but it is actually generating a particular type of content.
Yeah, thanks, Abe. I think those are all really important insights and observations. And one of the things that I think can be frustrating is to see kind of how slowly these wheels of regulation and governance turn. But in some ways also, the flip side of that is these are really hard questions and they're evolving. And I think there's an importance to trying to, if political elites are going to take action, to kind of take the right action, because what they're stepping into are really fundamental questions of freedom of expression. And so if they're going to take those steps, they should understand what the ramifications of that are. And I think we see from those initial two almost caricatures on Capitol Hill that were actually real life, there's still a lack of understanding. And so I think we are still in this kind of investigatory period as to how do we think about what these platforms are doing. And in some ways too, I just want to kind of add that it's kind of like studying and carrying out conflict is that it's very easy to kind of fight the last war. And I think in some ways, what we see with those two kind of first sets of vignettes, they're addressing very different threats. The first was the outside threat of foreign election interference, and the second is the companies themselves and the pernicious effects, the unintended consequences of a company that is profit seeking. And I think it, again, can be really easy to knee jerk into, we need to fix that. But I actually think in this sense, it's a real challenge, because I think that the tobacco analogy is at least in the right ballpark, but I don't think it's exactly right either. And so I think we not only have kind of a context that is novel, but I think it's evolving and it's shifting, as we've seen just in a 4-year period. So, and some of the whistleblower and the Wall Street Journal's investigation of kind of what Facebook has known is quite interesting. The question, I think, again, is how to respond to that. And I think the way to do that is to really kind of be doing more investigation and kind of problem solving as to what is to frame the problem first before we can start tackling it. I feel like it's an incomplete answer to your question, but I think it's really that sort of ambiguity or indeterminacy is driven in part by the fact that we really do have this kind of evolutionary kind of context that we're trying to graft onto.
Yeah, I mean, I think I completely agree with what you are saying. I think for me, it's at the government level and the policy level, there was how should we regulate, social media? Also, how should we think about a global information architecture? And it was really based on self-regulation. It was the idea that the firms held similar views to what our government priorities were. And so I'm just wondering if the government needs to rethink that and say, actually, now we know what this business model is. It's not exactly, the keepers of open media and free equal access. It has a business model that could diverge from our, it could be promoting the disinformationers, the Russian disinformation campaign, more than, let's say, just your everyday human. And so then the basic principle of governance has to be revisited in terms of our national security policy. It's like if this is what should we be promoting at the global level in terms of regulating social media? Since the Clinton administration, it's been, let the industry do it. They're good stewards. They'll do this. And I'm just wondering if the balance has maybe shifted there.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I've been thinking a lot about is this notion of kind of naming and shaming, kind of normative sanction against these firms that overstep or don't step far enough. And so it's just a really tricky needle to thread from a regulatory standpoint that doesn't also step on the toes of the First Amendment, to think about, okay, what would be the regulatory steps you would take to address what you're raising? Do you kind of have a tax on clicks, or do you I feel like the common reaction is to see this as antitrust, and so we're going to kind of force these companies to Facebook to divest of Instagram. But each of these, and I think this is how the policy process often is that, well, that might not be a good option, but is it the least bad of the bad options? But right now, it seems like what's happening is in the vacuum of that we are seeing some regulation that's coming from kind of these communities, and the sense that they will either boycott Facebook or use other social media platforms, and that they can kind of vote with their feet that way. And it's not obviously a perfect solution, but I think some of this, the frequency now with which Facebook is having to at least be accountable to the public and to members of Congress, I think is a step at least in the direction of some introspection, that there is kind of a constituency that they have to attend to. I don't think it's quite the Wild West that it was 10 years ago. I don't think it's perfect either, but I think there is this growing awareness that can lead them to realize that, look, they're going to lose users if they, and even like actually insofar as, they were going to do, so I think, in political science, we try to think about counterfactuals and unobservables. And one of the outcomes that we actually can point to because of this increased scrutiny that didn't take the form of a law is that Facebook, we know, was going to have an Instagram for young kids. And that led to an outrage. And the outrage was not just because they were doing this at ages that were kind of inappropriate, possibly, or where this could kind of go astray, but also that they knew that this was going to happen, that was the whole point, is to basically monetize young women, young girls' emotions. And the fact that then they have said, we are not going down that road, points to some sort of almost compliance pull from these more informal mechanisms of sanction.
So I just, I have one more question before I turn it over to the Q&A, but I wanted to switch the theme and just think about like previous periods of subversion, like this kind of tactic of like, go mess with another country's information space, whether it's propaganda or having, these kinds of embedded, we've all maybe not watched The Americans, it's like trying to manipulate your competitors' domestic political systems. And just kind of, if there's lessons to be drawn from that, because it's clearly not the first time that Russia has tried to meddle in US politics. And, there have been like the head of cybersecurity for the Trump administration. He retired, he resigned in kind of like admonition, but he had this recent op-ed where he was like, we need to just hit back. We need to, like take every kind of tool that we have. And so I'm just wondering what you think about, like, is there a deterrence game? Is this like, how should we think about the interaction between states as they engage in this? It's not like top level conflict. They're not killing each other, but they're using these lower level tools to stick it in the eye of their adversary. And how does that game out? Or, what should policymakers be thinking about?
Yeah, that's a good question. And to me, in a lot of ways, that starts to feel a little bit more like the old wine and old bottles problem of like just pure propaganda and information operations. And so what does that mean for us? I think what that means is that, a lot of these things can go on behind the scenes. And it's almost like if these countries are not engaging in those kinds of tactics, they're playing with one hand behind their back. But I think these are kind of tactics that are pretty much above board in many cases. And actually what's interesting to me in a way is watching kind of how China has started to play this game, how the Taliban was trying to play this game, using social media to emphasize the kind of virtues of their particular regime or their particular approach to governance. And so, I don't know, I guess in a way, what that maybe suggests is that there are some somewhat not universal, but globalized values that are at least causing different governments or different actors to be aware that they need to think about how they are acting internationally, because those things do sort of matter. So I don't know, I guess I'm coming back to one of your earlier questions about this demise of cyber utopianism, which, as you were suggesting, there was initially this view that, well, if we have the diffusion of technology and social media, that can help groups overcome the rebel's dilemma and overthrow their governments, and it turns out that these governments just basically cut off access to these platforms. But a kind of maybe different angle on that is that there is some optimism to be had in this domain, which is because there are very few, if you think about the tree in the forest metaphor, what social media does is it means that there are very few forests where there's no one to hear the tree falling, because everything is captured now. And in a way, the downside of that is that, people would say, well, we have a cancel culture. On the upside of that, though, is people are on notice. And that's not just individuals doing bad things, but it's the companies themselves. And so I think there's a kind of there's an upside of that to be considered.
Great. So one of the questions in the chat, I'm going to go to Kate first. She asked her master's level seminar to rank in order the 5 most powerful actors in international politics. And most put the US and then China, but several put Facebook as number 1. And what do you think of that assessment? Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. So, when I first read this statement from Zuckerberg that Facebook is more like a government than a company, I thought it was a little hubristic. But I think that as I have looked at this more, it's so large, and I think it can, almost as I was suggesting just now, it's almost like a government institution, international organization of sorts, because it is controlling the flow. If we think back on that image, maybe that was before I was I was sharing my screen, but that relationship between the media, basically the media kind of interpreting events, that the events themselves are not kind of understood in some unmediated way. And so how do people observe what's happening outside their window? Well, outside their window, they can look and see, but just sort of like in Afghanistan or in Tahrir Square, this is through a kind of mediated picture of reality. And what is that mediated picture? And that is through these social media platforms, as I was suggesting earlier, is that people are have gotten their news from social media. And so that is itself acting, I don't know as a government per se, but powerful actors. I mean, but if we are considering kind of powerful actors in international politics rather than states, I mean, I can see that these social media firms are really kind of, the fact that they're so transnational does make them more important than any individual country, because they are kind of the vehicle for all of the interactions that happen from country to country.
Yeah, I mean, I think just to follow up on that is the idea that, information is kind of the key part of government. It's like, to make decisions, you have to have information. And also, you have to have information about what's happening in your society. And I think that's why media has always been, it's the other pillar of government, or, that kind of thing. But then when you have this thing being transnational, and its objective is actually not just to distribute information, but it's to generate particular content that, captures eyeballs and clicks, it then, you can see that this is a really powerful thing that's taking you in a different direction than maybe you originally thought of media doing. So, if we're re-knitting together the kind of cyberkinetic infrastructure of governance, I think you could make a claim that it's a really powerful force, whether it's a government or not, I think, but it's definitely shaping the way we make decisions, which seems to be at the center of governance. Okay, so, who was that? Was it Sarah? Were you going to add?
Yeah, no, I was just going to say that I think this is why some countries have now increasingly tried to exert a greater degree of digital sovereignty, is that they want more control over the way in which information, this central currency of international politics and domestic politics, is being filtered in and through their country. And so I think that's why they're trying to erect some of these, not walls, but like try to reassert some agency, because they basically have this outside actor of Facebook or Instagram or whatever, there's TikTok, that's shaping their politics in ways that have usurped some of the legitimacy of their political authority.
Yeah, and that's a great segue. We have two questions. One is from Sean Connor, and the other is from Jonas Herring, and they're thinking about the what are the solutions part. Like what are discrete solutions to these issues. And Jonas in particular brings up this question of digital sovereignty. He even says in your book you discuss buy now Amazon.com. But I think the question there is, is Europe in some ways, they've been pushing a bunch of different potential solutions. So there's the digital sovereignty discussion. There's also this legislation, the Digital Single Market and the Digital Services Act, which think about making these companies more regulatable. I think they're called gatekeepers in the legislation that would have to face certain regulations. One of the questions by Jonas is like, there's also potential downsides to this, like countries like Russia copying this for nefarious purposes, not just to create, let's say, a level playing field, but also to crack down on their own societies. But anyway, I think this question of like, there are these different solutions, these government regulations that are being pro-offered, and how do you assess those both as models and in their own right, as a solution?
Yeah, as I mentioned before, that policy is always about trade-offs and often about least bad options. And as much as I think it's easy as it is to kind of critique the status quo here, I find myself extremely wary of some of these possible alternatives because of what Jonas actually, alludes to or speaks to here, which is, and something that doesn't come up in his comment in the chat, but I'll point to in a second. But he's absolutely right that these countries then can and have used these restrictions on democratic platforms as legitimation for much more repressive measures that they're taking against their people and democratic dissent, internal dissent within their countries. And I think that's a really important consideration, which is we need to think about kind of what these measures, how they get basically imported by other countries to justify repressive actions. And I think this is a bit of a slippery slope kind of argument, but it's not, that doesn't make it a bad argument, but which is that, look, once you start going down this road of restricting speech in one context, well, let's just kind of morph that into our Russian context or morph that into our Chinese context. And suddenly, they're using the US or European approach to misinformation as a way to restrict their internal dissent. It's a little bit like, that one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. It's like, in this case, well, we're restricting free speech because it's for a good cause here, but now they're doing this and this is actually like repressive. And so, that hypocrisy comes about because we go down the road of, if we go down that road of restricting content. What I was also going to say though about policy is that there are always these laws of unintended consequences. And I think I referenced something along these lines later in the book, which is that in Europe, there was this, and I don't know if this is still in place, but that Facebook had to remove misinformation within 24 hours or be fined some pretty hefty fine. And again, what I think we've seen and learned is that defining misinformation is really tricky. And so, for a lot of reasons, and one of them is that, and I was looking at this in the context of COVID, is that scientific consensus on something where there's a lot of uncertainty, like a novel pandemic, a novel virus, shifts over time. So how do we think about what's misinformation and what's just a lack of certainty about a particular issue? And so how do we kind of fine a company for something that is really hard to adjudicate? And I think that's where one has to be pretty wary of overstepping as a democratic government, which is that we should really take free speech as pretty sacrosanct, and that there are these consequences of going down a road in which we start to kind of clip those wings.
So on just to think about the flip side of that, so there's the question of what governments should do, but thinking about what the companies themselves are doing or should do. And many of the social media companies, they have a very complex structure of how they manage these types of problems. So they have their terms of service, they have the different rules spelled out of what's acceptable or not acceptable. Then like Facebook, it has this supervisory board, the oversight board that gives recommendations of what should be happening. One of the things I thought was interesting in the Wall Street Journal expose was the kind of like, differential treatment of the terms of service across users. So they're like the important users, let's say, or like the high profile users, and they're not getting kind of regulated by the terms of service in the same way that your average Joe maybe is being regulated. And so how do you think about like governance in a system where it's up to the companies and they themselves, have let's say the rule of law is not as clear as maybe, we'd like to believe, oh, there's a term of service, everybody has to follow the terms of service, that's the rules. But then there's, this great, what should happen, or is that just the way, markets work, or, how do you think about that?
Yeah, thanks, Abe. It's also just a great set of questions and observations. Is, are we dealing with a fundamentally flawed product, or is it that we have a product where the market isn't working perfectly, but with more accountability, it can function more efficiently? And I would think that, at least from my vantage point, it's looking more like the latter, which is, okay, you have these social media companies that really like take off. We had a number of kind of failed ones early on, MySpace, that, didn't really get the uptake. And then Facebook takes off, but no one's read the terms and conditions, terms of service. It's all in there, but no one actually kind of read it closely. So we had then that stage of awareness. Oh, okay. So then you have the shift to like some percentage of people make their profiles private. And so I wonder whether we're just kind of in this evolutionary process where, okay, now we have the accountability, the sort of, again, public sanction and public awareness of what they're consuming, and keeping these companies in check to keep that market functioning smoothly. I was thinking about your metaphor, your analogy of the tobacco industry. And I think one key difference is that there is no safe use of tobacco. Every cigarette you smoke can shorten your life. And so having a law that says that people under the age of whatever it is can't smoke seems pretty cut and dry. I think the reason why this is so challenging and why that metaphor kind of runs up against some walls in its application to social media is kind of comes back to this differential gains model. If it works well, I mean, we do want people to be more knowledgeable about the political process. We do want them to be politically involved. And so we know social media, if it is used properly, can make people more informed. It can get them more politically involved. It can make them more likely to vote. These are all good things. And there's no sort of equivalent on the tobacco side. So I think that's sort of where you get a larger array of trade-offs to consider, and why this sort of investigatory process in which people are learning more about what they're consuming has been an important step in all this. I think the way in which Facebook does, again, coming back to this question of, are they more like a government and a powerful actor, is relevant, is just how little, it's almost like so much of what they were doing was like in a classified skiff, is like everything, I think this also came up in these recent, at least in the Saturday Night Live version of these Capitol Hill hearings, which is like, so your algorithm, how big is that algorithm? And tell us more about it. And so that has been very shrouded in secrecy, which is how does the Facebook algorithm capitalize on people's emotions and what they buy and what matters to them. And so I think maybe increase to your point earlier, Abe, about information and transparency is sort of lifting the hood to see what's under this corporate structure at Facebook can start to chisel away at these adverse consequences we've seen in terms of governments and governance.
Great. So Sean Connor has another question, which is about, if there's this kind of tit for tat use of subversion. So, the Russians use disinformation against us, we use the disinformation against China, is there some, and also the techniques escalate. So, deep fakes and the kind of technologies you're talking about, like that we start to become much more sophisticated at blurring reality in the way that we're generating this disinformation. Is there a threat to the system itself? There've been, the ongoing conversations about the splinter net, that the internet itself will break down into like regional blocks or be much more fragmented. Where do you kind of see social media's, is it the wedge that breaks apart the internet, or do you think it's something that will manage and get through onto the other side?
Yeah, I don't know what the other side will look like, but I subscribe less to the break the internet view of things and more of a kind of evolutionary perspective that it will kind of continue to morph rather than have almost like an inflection point where we see something dramatically different. I think for a while there was a view that we were going to have these two internets, one that was sort of China dominated, one that was US dominated. And I'm not sure I even see that really either. I think that there's almost like, and this is potentially problematic in its own way, but maybe not, which is almost the homogenization of these internet cultures, in which we see, again, there are two sides of this. I mean, I think maybe because I'm dispositionally more optimistic about things, including technology, but that if we can have, because of social media, a more universalized set of values, and more transparency and visibility into what these governments are doing, because people are walking around with a cell phone all the time and recording and documenting these human rights violations, does that create accountability? And I think there's a way in which that actually does take place, is that we have more of a window into these behaviors than we would otherwise. And I think that happens, whether it's in the US domestic context or internationally. And so there's an upside to that. And so I think, again, it's easy to really focus on the pernicious effects of social media, but I think important to remember and think about where that transparency can actually have salutary effects.
Okay, so I think we have time for a quick last question, and I'm going to totally change kind of subject topics, but I'm just wondering, if you had the researcher's dream of kind of one research question, one data set, one next, where do you think research on social media and national security, where should it go next? Where would you be pushing people to shine the spotlight?
Well, one of the things I've been really intrigued by is how it is that a lot of this, the social scientific work on the effect of social media has kind of null findings, which is like, and the reason there are these null findings is because the argument suggests that there's a selection effect. People are selecting into certain filter bubbles that with views that they already subscribe to. But what's interesting again about this Wall Street Journal expose was that the company itself appeared to conclude that they are changing people's political views, which is very much at odds with the social scientific inferences that have been drawn. Now, one view is that the reason why Facebook's conclusions are different is because they can do A/B testing in ways that you can't do as social scientists. But that's what I'm really intrigued by, is why do you get these differences in conclusions between the company itself and outsiders who have studied this?
That's really fascinating. And I think there was an earlier leak from Facebook where there was a similar finding about kind of radicalization, that there was like these flags going up that they were finding that they were actually radicalizing German right-wing extremists, and what should they do about it? And so I think that that's a great an area to focus on, is this disconnect potentially between the broader community's research and Facebook's research. I think I've been following a little bit of Kate Starbird's work in this area, and she's been looking very specifically at the disinformation part and like how it has amplified, polarization in these places. But this broader topic, I don't know very much about it. And I think it's a great, so if there's funders out there in the universe, come fund Sarah to do this research. Okay, with that, I just want to thank Sarah again for the great conversation. I also want to invite people back in a few weeks. October 28th is our next session, if I got that right. Oh, I hope I did. Yes, October 28th. It will be on artificial intelligence and international security. We've got another great group of speakers. So please come back and we'll continue the conversation. Thanks again, Sarah. Thanks everybody for joining.
Thanks, Kate.